Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Sunday to you. I am going to continue on from where we were reading. I just got a blip on the screen, so hopefully you caught that. If not, good afternoon, everyone, and happy Sunday to you. I am going to continue reading Carl Rogers on Becoming a Person, and we're going to pick up where we left off yesterday with the Rochester Years, and we're going to read through to Ohio State Years, which is page 13. So we're going to stop right before Ohio State Years. The Rochester Years. The next 12 years in Rochester were exceedingly valuable ones. For at least the first 8 of these years, I was completely immersed in carrying on practical psychological service, diagnosing and planning for the delinquent and underprivileged children who were sent to us by the courts and agencies, and in many instances, carrying on treatment interviews. It was a period of relative professional isolation where my only concern was in trying to be more effective with our clients. We had to live with our failures as well as our successes so that we were forced to learn. There was only one criterion in regard to any method of dealing with these children and their parents, and that was, does it work? Is it effective? I found I began increasingly to formulate my own views out of my everyday working experience. 3 significant illustrations come to mind, all small but important to me at the time. It strikes me that they are all instances of disillusionment, when an authority with materials, with myself. In my training, I had been fascinated by Dr. William Healy's writings, indicating that delinquency was often based on sexual conflict, and that if this conflict was uncovered, the delinquency ceased. In my first or second year at Rochester, I worked very hard with a youthful pyromaniac who had an unaccountable impulse to set fires. Interviewing him day after day in the detention home, I gradually traced back his desire to a sexual impulse regarding masturbation. Eureka! The case was solved. However, when placed on probation, he again got into the same difficulty. I remember the jolt I felt. Healy might be wrong. Perhaps I was learning something Healy didn't know. Somehow this incident impressed me with the possibility that there were mistakes in authoritative teachings and that there was still new knowledge to discover. The second naive discovery was of a different sort. Soon after coming to Rochester, I led a discussion group on interviewing. I discovered a published account of an interview with a parent, approximately verbatim, in which the caseworker was shrewd, insightful, clever, and led the interview quite quickly to the heart of the difficulty. I was happy to use it as an illustration of good interviewing technique. Several years later, I had a similar assignment and remembered this excellent material. I hunted it up again and reread it. I was appalled. Now it seemed to me to be a clever, legalistic type of questioning by the interviewer, which convicted this parent of her unconscious motives and wrung her from the admission of her guilt. I now knew from my experience that such an interview would not be of any lasting help to the parent or the child. It made me realize that I was moving away from any approach which was coercive or pushing in clinical relationships, not for philosophical reasons, but because such approaches were never more than superficially effective. The third incident occurred several years later. I had learned to be more subtle and patient in interpreting a client's behavior to him, attempting to time it in a gentle fashion which would gain acceptance. I had been working with a highly intelligent mother whose boy was something of a Healy-on. The problem was clearly her early rejection of the boy, but over many interviews I could not help her to this insight. I drew her out, I gently pulled together the evidence she had given, trying to help her see the pattern, but we got nowhere. Finally, I gave up. I told her that it seemed we had both tried, but we had failed, and that we might as well give up our contacts. She agreed. So we concluded the interview, shook hands, and she walked to the door of the office. Then she turned and asked, "Do you ever take adults for counseling here?" When I replied in the affirmative, she said, "Well then, I would like some help." She came to the chair she had left and began to pour out her despair about her marriage, her troubled relationship with her husband, her sense of failure and confusion, all very different from the sterile case history she had given before. Real therapy began then, and ultimately it was very successful. This incident was one of a number which helped me to experience the fact, only fully realized later, that it is the client who knows what hurts, what directions to go, what problems are crucial, what experiences have been deeply buried. It began to occur to me that unless I had a need to demonstrate my own cleverness and learning, I would do better to rely upon the client for the direction of the movement of the process. Psychologist or? During this period, I began to doubt that I was a psychologist. The University of Rochester made it clear that the work I was doing was not psychology, and they had no interest in my teaching in the psychology department. I went to meetings on the American Psychological Association and found them full of papers on the learning process of rats and laboratory experiments which seemed to me to have no relation to what I was doing. The psychiatric social workers, however, seemed to be talking my language. So I became active in the social work profession, moving up to local and even national offices. Only when the American Association for Applied Psychology was formed did I become really active as a psychologist. I began to teach courses at the university on how to understand and deal with problem children under the Department of Sociology. Soon, the Department of Education wanted to classify these as education courses also. Before I left Rochester, the Department of Psychology, too, finally requested permission to list them, thus at least accepting me as a psychologist. Simply describing these experiences makes me realize how stubbornly I have followed my own course, being relatively unconcerned with the question of whether I was going with my group or not. Time does not permit me to tell of the work of establishing a separate guidance center in Rochester, nor the battle with some of the psychiatric profession which was included. These were largely administrative struggles which did not have too much to do with the development of my ideas. My children. It was during these Rochester years that my son and daughter grew through infancy and childhood, teaching me far more about individuals, their development, and their relationships than I could ever have learned professionally. I don't feel I was a very good parent in their early years, but fortunately my wife was. And as time went on, I believed I gradually became a better and more understanding parent. Certainly the privilege during these years and later of being in relationship with two fine, sensitive youngsters through all their childhood pleasure and pain, their adolescent assertiveness and difficulties, and on to their adult years in the beginning of their own families, has been a priceless one. I think my wife and I regard as one of the most satisfying achievements which we have had apart, the fact that we can really communicate in a deep way with our grown-up children and their spouses, and they with us. Excuse me. Let me read that last sentence again. I think my wife and I regard as one of the most satisfying achievements in which we had a part, the fact that we can really communicate in a deep way with our grown-up children and their spouses, and they with us. End of reading today. Tomorrow I will continue on with the Ohio State Years and go through the end of this section and stop at the bottom of 15 right before we get to some significant learning. So have a wonderful rest of your Sundays. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and love you all.